let's just start off by giving Russell Wilson some credit. I think I came off as very critical of Russell Wilson yesterday, and my reasons for it were I just don't like the tone that I felt came out of his many comments yesterday, whether it was on the Dan Patrick Show or on his Zoom for the Walter Payton Man of the Year, because to me it felt like he was pointing at the offensive line as a bigger reason than him and everybody else that was involved in the Seahawks' struggles down the stretch. It was not about whether or not he was factually right. The offensive line has not been great recently. It was about what was the point of this, what was your end game. But he had kept everything so close to the vest early on that you had only heard it through Jason LaCanfora, essentially his court. He's actually putting his name on it now. He did it twice yesterday. He didn't do it willingly, but he did it twice. He deserves some credit for that, because I just don't like this rumor-mongering stuff that takes place in sports these days where, oh, someone in his camp says that he's unhappy with X, Y, Z. No, let's just get it out in the open. Because you get it out in the open, you know what happens next? Generally, these things get taken care of. And then you can look at it in the rearview mirror, and we can all perhaps, hopefully, I'm hoping someday, look back at it and say to ourselves, ha, remember that fight that we had? Oh, classic us. But what could he have gained from this? What's going to change now that the Seahawks know how he feels about the offensive line? Which, by the way, I'm sure that they knew already. You think that any team, especially after Andrew Luck walked away, is looking at their offensive line and saying, yeah, we can totally ignore this? No team is doing that. Russell Wilson might say, well, hang on, though. They have ignored this. This is where the facts start to get ignored. Russ is essentially saying, hey, you guys haven't tried hard enough to go and get offensive linemen for me. That's factually inaccurate. It hasn't worked out for the Seahawks, but they've put a lot of effort into trying to build an offensive line around Russ. Let's start going all the way back to the beginning of the Pete Carroll, John Schneider era. They used a first-round pick on Russell Okung. It worked out pretty well, right? First-round pick on James Carpenter the next season. They signed Robert Gallery. They drafted John Moffitt as well. Those didn't necessarily work out so well. Go a couple of years where maybe there's not a real investment in the offensive line as Russ is getting better and better. But, I mean, the defense turned into one of the best defenses in NFL history over that stretch. They bring in Justin Britt in 2014. Second-round pick. That worked out pretty well. Then, all of a sudden, things, at least as far as the draft goes and as far as free agency goes, didn't go so well for a little bit. In 2016, they drafted Jermaine Ifedi. I think a lot of people were happy to see him leave after the 2019 season. They drafted in the third round a guy by the name of Reese Odiambo. I don't know anything about him. That didn't work out. That's just how you answer that one.
He was the left tackle in that same year that they traded for Dwayne Brown.
There we go.
And it was not good.
In 2017, the Seahawks at the trade deadline, DJ Wilder behind the glass, trade a third and a second-round pick for Dwayne Brown. That's swinging for the fences and taking advantage of a bad situation and not having to give up a whole lot of capital to get a guy who, at that point in time, was one of the best left tackles in the NFL. They brought in Luke Jokel that offseason, didn't work out. They brought in Node Abushi that offseason, didn't work out. They drafted Ethan Posick in the second round. Honestly, that has not worked out until this past season. 2018, they signed DJ Fluker. 2019, they signed Mikey Apati. And then this past year, they drafted Damian Lewis. Yeah, they built a Thunderdome of offensive linemen out of essentially the bargain bin at a Walmart where you find all those old DVDs, usually featuring Steven Seagal movies. But they found Brandon Shell, and they used B.J. Finney to get Carlos Dunlap. You can't say the Seahawks haven't tried. You can't. And I feel like that's what we're getting out of Russ here. Now, it's another thing entirely to say, well, you need to hit on these. But that's so much easier said than done. And that also rubs me the wrong way here. Because essentially what Russ is doing in saying, well, you have to give me more on the offensive line, you have to do better on the offensive line, you're going up to John Schneider, a guy who, yes, has not been perfect. What general manager has? This is a very inexact science in the NFL building a roster. He's basically saying, I get that you're trying, but stop being bad at roster building. John Schneider, guy coming off of a great draft, who helped, again, establish what this is. And this isn't me saying that Russ is wrong and that the offensive line isn't good. He's right in bringing that up. Wouldn't this have the same power if he's bringing it up behind closed doors? Or is this actually going to create some sort of change? And that's the next part of this. Okay, well, what do you want, Russ? Do you want the Seahawks to draft an offensive lineman in the second round? There are other things that they could potentially draft in the second round. Would it be a cornerback? Could it be another pass rusher? It's not as if this roster is perfect everywhere except for on the offensive line. Do you want a big-ticket purchase in free agency on the offensive line? So take a look at Jack Conklin. And Jake, who we're going to have on at 10:30, really wanted the Seahawks to sign Jack Conklin this offseason. That really worked out for the Cleveland Browns. But don't look at one free agency acquisition and act as if that is the way that it typically goes. I would just take a look at some of the big free agent contracts given out to offensive linemen who are a scarce commodity in today's league over the last couple of years. At guard, Andrew Norwell. He signed a 5-year, $66 million deal with the Jaguars. They regret that immensely. Part of that's because they're bad, but he didn't help that offensive line a whole lot. Then you got at tackle, Nate Solder, guy that was working with the New England Patriots for a long period of time. He had Dante Scarnecchia, maybe the greatest offensive line coach of all time. I think some would argue others. But I know, having watched that team for a long time, there was a reason that offensive line was so good for a long period of time. Partly it was because of that coach. Another part of it is because Tom Brady gets rid of the ball extremely quickly, much like Peyton Manning did. That sort of goes into these offensive lines that were in front of them. We talk about them as being these amazing offensive lines. Well, when you got a quarterback that gets the ball out quickly, that makes the offensive line look a whole lot better, as opposed to a quarterback that extends plays, yada, 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 yada. Okay, so when you see another tackle brought aboard, how about Trent Brown? Also came out of the New England Patriots system. Goes to the Raiders, played pretty well his first season there, Pro Bowler, but then he gets hurt. They're paying a lot of money for a guy who was hurt and then opted out because of COVID-19. I wonder how John Gruden's going to feel about Trent Brown going forward, given his propensity to get very frustrated with veteran players and sometimes rub them the wrong way. That goes back to his time in Tampa Bay. So those are three guys that were signed for big ticket prices. They didn't work out. Does Russ just want the Seahawks to say, all right, here's a bunch of cash, just throw it at an offensive lineman? Because that's the vibe I'm getting. And that's not going to fix things, necessarily. It could. It also could tremendously backfire and keep the Seahawks from being able to do a lot of other things on the roster. Because, again, it's not just about the offensive line this offseason. Your defense was not good enough last year. It needs to be better, and there are positions that you're going to need to address this offseason. Because you saw what the Bucs did. That Bucs defense, it carried them. You saw what the Rams defense did. That Rams defense somehow carried Jared Goff to the second round of the playoffs. You still have things to address on that side of it. But, okay, let's continue to go with Russell Wilson's frustration over the offensive line, which I want to say one more time. It's warranted, the frustration. No one is denying that. No one is denying a guy, he's gotten sacked 40-plus times a year. He plays a role in those sacks, but I think a lot of people are getting it twisted that by saying that he plays a role in those sacks, that he is the main reason for those sacks. No, this is a scheme. Let's make a pie chart. Divided into 30, 30, 30. Actually, that adds up to 90. 33%, 33%, 33%, blah, blah, blah. You got an offensive line that's to play here. You got a quarterback who's to play here. You got a scheme who's to play here. Guess what? The scheme, it's changing. It should be better next offseason. And yet, you still have Russell Wilson on Friday talking about how the scheme wasn't good enough last year. Well, last year is last year, Russ. Move on. This offensive line next season, how do you get it better? Do you go the same routes that some other teams with similar quarterbacks in terms of they're mobile? Some of them are better. Actually, check that. I don't, maybe only one of them is better. But I would say these guys are about the same skill set-wise as Russell Wilson, just from this standpoint. They actually are known for their ability to throw the football, and they're also mobile. Here's the list. Deshaun Watson, Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers. Actually, I guess that makes it two better than Russell Wilson. Dak Prescott, Carson Wentz, Josh Allen, and Kyler Murray. If you take a look at what was invested in the offensive lines in front of all those guys, I think you will be surprised to see that some of those teams put some serious resources into the offensive line in front of them. Point at the Houston Texans. They drafted a first-round pick, Titus Howard, a second-round pick, Max Sharping at tackle. They traded 2 first-round picks for Laramie Tunsil, a.k.a., I guess, gas mask bong guy. I like to call him Laramie. So that's the Texans. That hasn't worked out because Deshaun Watson's still getting sacked a you-know-what ton. Carson Wentz, he's been sacked at least 33 times in every single season he's played in the league. Somehow he got sacked 50 times last year and he only played in 12 games. The Eagles drafted an offensive lineman in the first round. They got a steal in free agency in Brandon Brooks, who got hurt before the season. Lane Johnson, they had drafted 4th overall. Jason Kelsey, they have a good offensive line. Oh, Carson Wentz is still getting beat up. It's not to say that it's all the offensive line's fault. I mean, Carson Wentz definitely plays a huge role in that. But the great offensive line in front of a quarterback doesn't necessarily always work. Dak Prescott, great offensive line in front of him, right? All those first-round picks. Guess what? Dak Prescott got hurt this past season. First-round picks didn't protect him. The first-round picks in that offensive line, by the way, I would say that considering the resources the Cowboys have invested into that offense, it's kind of underachieved a little bit. Then take a look at some other teams. Bills haven't really invested a whole lot in their offensive line. It's worked out. Mitch Morse is really the only guy that they've signed in free agency over the last couple of years. As far as the Kansas City Chiefs, who obviously kind of met the short end of the stick of this when it came to the Super Bowl, the only really serious investment they've made in their offensive line over the last couple of seasons, not to say that they don't have any good offensive linemen, is that they extended Laurent Duvernay-Tardif. He didn't play this past year. The Packers, all right, he's got David Bakhtiari. He's got another guy, Lindsley, making over $8 million a year. Do you know how many first or second round offensive linemen they've drafted since 2010 when they got Brian Bulaga? 3. One was in 2011. The other 2, Jason Spriggs, didn't work out so much, and we'll see with Elgton Jenkins. So teams invest in the offensive line in front, and it doesn't necessarily always work out. And I feel like Russell Wilson needs to be made aware of this.